That's the nicest thing he's ever said about me, actually. And I did it myself.
You did it yourself?
I did my haircut myself, I said.
Wow. Okay, we can start now. Welcome to our second webinar on the coronavirus crisis and the US leadership. And today we have two excellent panelists again. We have Shadi Hamid from Brookings Institution and we have Phil Gordon from CFR. I will not go over their long bios, and in the ad, actually, you can see their bios. We will start by several questions, several rounds of questions that I will ask to our panelists. And after that, or during the panel, you can write your questions to the chat window in Zoom so that I can see them, and I will direct those questions to our panelists. And we will start with the first question. Probably whoever is going to write, you know, like probably there will be a lot of history of this coronavirus, a lot of books on that. But one of the most important questions is what went wrong and why this coronavirus crisis becomes something major. And our two panelists, Phil and Shadi, has two different perspectives. They're not mutually exclusive, but they emphasize two different things. So we will start with Shadi. Shadi, you are in your Atlantic Monthly piece, you are talking about the China factor in this. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Good to be with you all. So I've been a little bit troubled by, let's say, some of the mainstream responses to the COVID crisis. It seems to me that on the center left and the left in particular, there's a lot of self-doubt and self-flagellation and talking about if only we could be more like China, you know, look how quickly and efficiently they were able to respond. If only we had a more centralized, efficient, technocratic, no nonsense leadership. That kind of discourse is something that we've seen a lot. And I think that that'll get us into some broader questions about how we interpret this moment. Are democracies or authoritarian regimes better at dealing with that crisis? And that's a big and I think very important debate. But when we come to the issue of China, and that's one thing I emphasized in my writing when this started, is we shouldn't forget that China, and by China I mean the Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party, is partly to blame for the very fact that this virus spread in the first place and the very fact that we have this global crisis in terms of the suppressing of information in those crucial early weeks and waiting about six weeks or so to even have a lockdown in Wuhan. And during that period, millions of people from that region were spreading throughout China, but also outside of China, beyond its own borders, which led. So, I mean, when people are heaping praise on China's efficient response, they're forgetting that the Chinese regime is to blame in the first place. And we have a kind of situation where China is both the arsonist and the firefighter, but just because they're fighting the fire now doesn't mean we should forget the fact that they started the fire in the first place, or at least allowed it to spread, let's say.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Phil? Your perspective on in your foreign affairs piece, you mostly talk about the US and how US handled this crisis. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Kilich, for having me. I mostly talk about the US, but what I focus on is not so much the way the US handled the crisis at home, but the US failure to lead abroad. Now, there are better, I would just stipulate at the start that the US badly handled it at home. When you look at more than 60,000 deaths and 1 million cases and per capita testing behind some 40 other countries in the world, I don't think there's any doubt that this is a manifest failure. But there are other people, epidemiologists and people who study this, who would be better placed to assess why it is that we so badly mismanaged it at home. My argument in that piece and my argument here is that we particularly managed it. And I mean, this session is about US global leadership.
Mm-hmm.
We failed, I think, and we missed an opportunity to demonstrate leadership abroad. Now, the two things are linked, because one of my points about the failure to demonstrate leadership abroad is when you can't even demonstrate competence and excellence at home, others are unlikely to turn to you. And actually, maybe we'll get into this, but Shadi's point about China, we would be better placed to rival China and to dismiss those arguments, which I agree are wrong, that China is better placed and that model is better placed to handle it. But we would certainly be better placed to win that argument if we had done better at home. And again, my point in the piece was also to say how badly Trump's America First approach to the world is relevant for a crisis like this. I mean, there is no better situation than a global pandemic that cries out for American leadership, but an approach where the president, and he said this early on, says, look, I'm the president of the United States, not the president of other countries. I'll deal with my country and you deal with yours. When, you know, there's a situation in which nobody is safe until everybody is safe, because if the virus exists, unless you're going to ban travel from everywhere all at once forever and impoverish yourself, then you have to take care to make sure that others are combating the pandemic well as well. And I think we completely dropped that ball, not just by underestimating its importance at home, but where was the leadership that I think most people would expect in a case like this? Traditionally, when there's a global crisis, the United States leads. Whether that's a security crisis like President George H.W. Bush in the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, or setting up the counter-ISIS coalition under Obama, but also on global health crises. George W. Bush on AIDS set up PEPFAR to deal with AIDS globally because that would threaten us and we had an interest in doing so. President Obama on Ebola worked with the World Health Organization, the UN. And I think the US in this case was nowhere to be found, even though this situation cries out for American leadership. The US was the head of the G7. We didn't use it. In fact, we couldn't even get a joint statement because of a disagreement about what to call it. We didn't use the G20, which is an American invention. We didn't really use the WHO, and now we're pulling our funding for it. So I think it's not just a question of how badly the US mismanaged it at home, but I think we've done damage to what I already think was the US leadership was already being questioned before this. And you can see that in global opinion polls and a lot of other evidence. But now I think it's even further damaged.
Something related to this, is it like we have seen this discussion in the media and among the observers of US foreign policy, there's a debate about capability and willingness. Do you think it was the problem of capability or was it the problem of willingness? Because people who see that US mismanaged, within the United States as well as the number of cases, number of tests and everything, they argue that maybe US was not capable to handle this or play the role of a leader in international system about the coronavirus. Do you think it was the willingness or the capability or both?
I think it was the mindset. I don't accept that we wouldn't have the capability to lead in a case like this. And I gave some examples on AIDS and Ebola where we did just that. I mean, obviously they're linked, but what I was trying to describe is a mindset that basically underplays the role of global leadership, and particularly in cases like this. The Trump administration every year since it's been in office has tried to cut foreign assistance by some 20%. And cut US support for global health by like 35%. Now, fortunately, Congress hasn't allowed them to do that, although they did cut funding for basic science and some of the domestic global health services that would have made us more capable of helping in a situation like this. But that in and of itself reflects a mindset that I think fails to recognize this point. That is more true in the case of a global pandemic than almost anything else. I mean, I think in general, you can argue, and that the past 70 years have shown that the United States is safer and more prosperous when the rest of the world is more stable, safe, and prosperous. And presidents prior to Trump always believed in that and invested that, even if it cost us money. They didn't always succeed, and they didn't always do it well, but that was the mindset. And then here, I think, unfortunately, The mindset has been, look, we're just going to deal with our own problems and everybody else can deal with theirs. So I challenge the notion that that's why I said it's a missed opportunity. I think a competent, determined American administration, first of all, would have been better prepared in the first place and wouldn't have wasted 3.5 years in not preparing for this. And you've all read the articles about the playbooks that were left from the previous administration about how to handle a pandemic and shutting down the office at the NSC. So I think it would have prepared better in the first place. And then once it happened, it would have very quickly taken it seriously, put competent people in charge, put the resources behind it. I mean, it's insane to suggest we wouldn't have had the resources to help fight this when we've passed now almost $3 trillion in economic compensation funding to deal with the aftermath. So I think that suggests that had we tried to get ahead of it with tests and protective equipment and support. I mean, my last point, so I mentioned foreign aid. I still don't think we're out of the woods on this. And I think developing countries in particular are incredibly vulnerable. They don't have the capacity that we do to do the social distancing. They don't have the healthcare infrastructures. And this could be the next shoe to drop. And we should be thinking about that now, and the US should be leading on that on simple humanitarian grounds, but also because if the virus is flourishing in Africa and Latin America and Asia, then we won't be safe from it here either.
Thank you. And my second question is about the international system. Shadi, we'll probably get a lot of questions on China, and we will get back to China at the end again. But there's a general question about the international system. So since the beginning of this crisis, there are this argument that there will be a transformation after the coronavirus. There are optimists who said that transformation will be something positive. There are those who says that it will be for bad. But they definitely argue that there will be a transformation of international system. And there are those who argue that there will be nothing, like it is the same thing. This will be just, fizzle away a few months later, probably after a vaccine or something. And there are those who argue that there will be only there are existing trends in the international system, and the coronavirus will only expedite the process, amplify the impacts of these processes, right? Like maybe protectionism, populism, xenophobia in some countries, and great power rivalry. So among these three different scenarios for the future, which one do you think is more plausible for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'd say, and this goes to what Phil was saying previously, it's really striking the degree to which I think we all feel the absence of leadership, that there is this kind of gaping hole that the US would traditionally fill. And I've been a pretty outspoken critic of Obama's foreign policy. And even if we go before that, I've been critical of George W. Bush's rehabilitation. I think that the Iraq war is still worse than pretty much anything Donald Trump has done. That said, as critical as I have been of Obama, one longs for, if only someone with the perceived steadiness of Obama would be in charge, even if it's still, on the rhetorical side and the policies aren't great, you still, in a time of crisis, want to feel like there are semi-competent people in charge. And you also want that sense of moral leadership and authority. Even, again, if it's not always reflected in actual policy, you at least want the pretense of that, right? So that's the first thing I'd say. Now, where we're going from here, I think, I'm not a big fan of the whole nothing will ever be the same type arguments, or everything has changed and there is pre-COVID, post-COVID, all that, in part because I think that there is a kind of a presentist bias in terms of our obsession with being in the present moment, and we can't remove ourselves and look at the broader picture. For those of us who are in lockdown, which is most of us, I presume, it feels like everything has changed because we're experiencing it every day. And it's hard for us to think past or think beyond this particular moment. But what we do know about human nature is that human beings crave normalcy, and they're very good at adapting. So I think I think that we'll see, after the worst of this crisis, God willing, passes, that people will almost be trying to revert to this, to what they perceive as normal. Now, that's one thing, just on the broader sort of theoretical level. But what I do think will change is that we will see an intensification of a kind of struggle that I think was already developing, a kind of ideological battle over the nature of political systems. And this was already why there was a lot of interesting debate around the so-called Chinese model before COVID, because there was a sense that that China, especially under the current leadership, is more ideologically oriented in terms of exporting a kind of authoritarian approach, and also the concentration camps where more than 1 million Muslims, and this kind of very aggressive totalitarian Chinese approach that was already emerging. But what I think now is that those dividing lines are going to be starker, and this is where I think there's a real question of whether the U.S. can actually say, hey, democracies are still better placed for this particular moment, and that most authoritarian regimes have failed to respond to COVID effectively, with perhaps the partial exception of China, if we want to have that debate. But generally speaking, authoritarian regimes are not good at dealing with crises. You might have a couple other exceptions in oil-rich countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it's hard to look at really successful authoritarian models here. If anything, the most successful models are Asian democracies like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. So I think we're going to really have to engage on this question of why democracies are still the better option. And I worry about whether we're going to have American leadership and this will depend on who wins in November, obviously, because if Biden wins, then
there are questions about that as well. It is coming.
So I'll leave that for later. Yeah.
Phil.
So first, just on that point, there's been a lot of debate about what does the record show that democracies do better authoritarian? Doesn't seem to me that that's the main variable. I mean, I think the evidence now, it turns out that you can have, incompetent democracies, competent democracies, incompetent authoritarian regimes, and competent ones as well. It's one variable, but I don't see a strong correlation between those two. And again, I've already criticized the US situation. But I guess on your question, Kilic, my response would be that I think this is just dividing us further along lines we were already divided on. So I guess, if I choose from your menu of options, it's the one that reinforces trends that were already going on. But I mean that less, even though I agree that, nationalism, populism reinforce, my point is that it feels to me like people who were already convinced of some argument point to this to reinforce their arguments. So, I began by saying, I think you could already have made the case against the Trump administration's global leadership style and America first nationalist populist foreign policy before this happened. And so I see this happen and I say, that clearly to me reinforces that actually we do need to care about what happens in other countries. We do need international cooperation. We do need international institutions. To me, that's manifest. But I acknowledge at the same time that people who took the view that this means we can't rely on foreign supply chains and that international organizations are ineffective and that open travel undermines our security, they're making those arguments. So I fear that what was already a divided world is now emerging from this even more divided, because there aren't a whole lot of people, it seems to me, who've watched this crisis and said, oh, you know what, my take on whatever it was, internationalism or democracy was wrong, and I've changed my view. So unfortunately, I think we were already divided, and this is going to just polarize us even further.
Thank you. And another question about the international institutions. Since the beginning of this crisis, actually, each and every international institution is under spotlight. There are criticisms for WHO, which Shadi mentioned just. United States suspend the funding of the organization. There are criticism about the UN system as a whole. There are questions about the future of EU following the failure in Spain and Italy, most notably. And there are now questions that maybe international institutions are not that effective in handling these kind of crises, and maybe it is the nation state. And there are arguments of bringing state back in, type of arguments saying that, well, you know, the most effective institutions that can handle these crises are the nation states, nothing other than that. So how do you characterize the potential future of these international institutions, WHO, European Union, and UN? Phil, let's start with you this time.
Look, we've known for a long time that international institutions are highly imperfect. They're bureaucratic. There are too many different bosses. They report to too many states that pay the bills and take the votes. And the WHO is a good example of that. Highly imperfect. In this case, we know that it was very worried about Chinese influence and therefore was reluctant to put the blame on China, reluctant to even mention the word Taiwan, and dropped the ball on certain things. They've always been imperfect. The UN is imperfect, the EU is imperfect. But to go from there to say, therefore, we shouldn't use them, we shouldn't fund them, let's just let the nation state do it, seems to me really short-sighted. I mean, that they're imperfect doesn't mean that they aren't doing really important things. And I would argue that the WHO has done really important things in parts of the world where we're not present. Polio eradication, sharing of data and information, especially in most of the countries that are not, you know, the leading industrialized countries. And certainly from the US point of view, it seems to be a little bit rich for the Trump administration or for President Trump himself to have his main critique of the WHO being that it was too respectful of China and unwilling to criticize the Chinese leadership over this crisis, or that it downplayed it. When he did exactly that, you know, earlier and more strongly than the WHO, in tweeting about how China's doing a great job and he has a great relationship with President Xi. So that critique seems to me a little bit rich. And I actually think what he is doing is attacking the WHO to have someone to blame. The WHO was actually earlier than Trump was to say this is a real crisis and this is a pandemic and people need to pay attention. I think a lot of countries around the world got that information from the WHO and were able to take advantage of it. But for Trump, dealing with what is manifest a failure to do much about this crisis before it was too late, decided to attack the WHO and blame it for things that he failed to do himself. And it's trying to distract us from the real problem. And I think, you know, even if you accept that the WHO is flawed and has certain constraints that could be better done by other institutions, well, then use other institutions. I mean, if the problem was too much Chinese influence of the WHO, then use the G7 or create a separate coalition. But of course, the US did neither of those things. And I would make the same argument, I won't go on, but, you know, blaming the European Union for this and saying that the nation state would be a better fix, I also don't see how that makes any sense at all. If anything, you could argue, as even to their credit, the Germans are arguing, that you need more European solidarity. So would Germany and France be safe if there wasn't an EU and just let the nation state of Italy deal with this? I don't understand that at all. So no, I think people will make those arguments, but they would be wrong. And if people think that the world was better equipped to deal with these problems or other problems before we had such institutions, you know, like in the 20s and 30s, that would be, it seems to me, a pretty tough case to make.
Shadi? You muted, I guess. Your mic, Shadi.
Okay, yes, I think that, okay, yeah, so, you know, on the WHO, I think that some of their rhetoric and their deference to China has been, you know, embarrassing and at times quite awful. That said, I think historically, and this is where, you know, I would agree with Phil, I mean, historically, the US approach is that when international institutions are doing things we don't like or aren't comfortable with, we try to engage more as the superpower. If we wanted to encourage a better approach from within institutions, That's something we're able to do, and we have historically been able to do. And that's generally been the US mindset, for the most part, when it comes to how to engage with with international institutions. What we're seeing with Trump is something different. And I think that's something that is self-defeating, which is we don't like what the WHO is doing, so we undermine them or withdraw support or whatever else it might be. I just can't see how that's going to be productive. On the issue of nationalism versus international institutions more generally, I think at some level, we're all becoming a bit more, we're all nationalist in some sense now, in that as Americans, we are naturally going to be primarily concerned with how our own government is dealing with this. And we're looking inward. We care about other countries, and we're following how other countries are dealing with this. And we obviously want to learn lessons from where we can. But I think everyone is more localized in that if you know people who are sick or dying from COVID or who have died, it really brings in the kind of sense of proximity and the local aspect to this crisis. And that, we as Americans want to do better, or if you're a New Yorker, we as New Yorkers want to do better. And being here in DC, we obviously care about the local context a lot. So I think that's something we're seeing and we will see going forward. And there's also a sense, I think, of national solidarity. Maybe not everyone has it, but we all know that we all saw those videos, in Italy or Spain, where the police would come in on the street when people were locked down, and a policeman would play like flamenco guitar or something, and people would be cheering from the balconies. There is this sense of we're all in this together, whatever criticisms we might have of our own governments. It's a collective experience that we as Americans are sharing together in real time.
Thank you. And now I have a set of questions that came from the audience, and I will start asking that. There are a lot of questions about China. So Shadi, we will start with you this time. Like the general among these questions, the idea is, will there be any change in China-US relations in the aftermath of this crisis? Yes, President Trump used to call it China virus. Now he's saying coronavirus, but I think he's using WHO as a proxy now to criticize China, not directly criticizing China, but indirectly mentioning that it is the WHO/China. So what will be the future of US-China relations? There was already debates about the trade war, about debates about the South China Sea, intellectual property right infringement, about everything. On top of that, now we have the coronavirus. Would it be something that will change the dynamics, or would it again amplify the existing trends in US-China relations? Shadi, let's start with you.
So, first of all, China is using this moment to really actively and aggressively undermine America in the court of public opinion. I mean, we're seeing the Chinese regime promoting conspiracy theories that this was, manufactured by the US military or in a US lab or whatever it might be. And there's this kind of unabashed propaganda that we're seeing. And I think that, I'm born and raised here in the US, but my parents are Egyptian, and I follow some of the Egyptian debate and also the Middle Eastern debate more broadly. And one of the predominant narratives that's spreading, and it's actually quite widespread now in Egypt among elites, is that the US created this virus. So we're in this context where China is trying to push its advantage in a rather cynical way. And, we talked about how China was suppressing information in the critical early weeks. There's a longer list of things that we can talk about. The fact that China refused to regulate its wet markets, and this is how these diseases keep on coming back. And China is, in some sense, an exporter of these types of diseases because of this lack of regulation. So, that we have to keep all of that in mind, and that China is not going to let up. So then the question is, I mean, obviously the relationship has already been strained. I'm very much of the view that we shouldn't go back to some normal friendly relationship with China. China is a nefarious force in international affairs, especially under its current leadership. Maybe that'll change. We don't know, and we'll have to wait and see. But this idea that we should try to go back to some mythical, idealized, reset with China, I think we're well past that, and the Chinese leadership has no interest or willingness to play a more constructive role or to be a constructive world actor, and we have to accept that. And there's a lot of implications of that we could talk about on supply chains and not being too reliant on China in a way that could have a detrimental economic impact on the US, and others can speak to that better than I can. But I think we just have to be aware that if we're thinking about how the world is changing, and I'm glad to see that Joe Biden has also taken a stronger line on some of this stuff after being initially criticized. So I think that we're seeing both parties moving in this direction of understanding that China is not going to be our friend.
Phil?
So I agree, and you began by talking about trends that are being reinforced, and this is one. I mean, already there was growing criticism of China. You mentioned, Kilich, the reasons. Obviously, the trade deficit was there for a long time, but intellectual property, internet security, election interference, South China Sea. This was already growing and looming. And now, this on top of that, 6 months before a presidential election is just a recipe for real tensions in US-China relations. We've seen that before, and candidates, going all the way back to Bill Clinton, if you want to take that example, have tended to run, you don't score any points by being soft on China. And so hawkishness tends to resonate, particularly during electoral periods, especially when there's genuine reasons for it, because I think, as Shadi has already explained, China bears a lot of responsibility for both the origin of this crisis and the way it was handled. So I don't have any doubt that this is going to be, the trend is going to be almost a competition about who can be tougher on China. President Trump has already signaled that he's going to try to use this as an electoral platform, which is frankly a little bit strange. And you could almost ask, he has a long history of doing things like this, accusing his opponents of the things that he's most guilty of. You could go down a long list of the ways in which he's done that. But here's one where, he was the one, it's in the clear public record, praising President Xi, talking about his great relationship with President Xi, downplaying the risk of virus, it appears, because he wanted to consolidate his trade deal with China, or at least the first phase of the trade deal with China. It does seem to be a lot of evidence that was one of the reasons he initially didn't want to put the blame on China. So he's in a funny place to, plus he's been president for 3.5 years. So it's a little bit hard to blame Joe Biden for, whatever failures we've seen against China, interfering with our elections and trade deficits and all that. Nonetheless, that's what he is going to do. And to the extent that Joe Biden at any point might have wanted to try to be a little bit more cautious on the China issue, which he got in trouble for earlier in the campaign. Remember, he said he questioned the notion that they were going to eat our lunch, I think was the phrase, basically suggesting that some of these hawks were going overboard and you should be more confident about the United States. Now, I don't think there's any space for that in the debate. So definitely there's going to be a harder line and more tensions with China. But I would caution, even I agree with everything Shadi said, and there's no way to avoid being honest about China and what it's doing in the world. At the same time, we have to be careful, especially in this electoral atmosphere, not to let it become counterproductive. So you can be as critical as you want, but we've now seen, even I think in today's Washington Post, there's a report about the administration not only allowing potentially people to sue China for its role in this, but questioning about whether to uphold our obligations on sovereign debt to China. To get them back, they hold a lot of US debt and we would not necessarily pay them back. That's when you start getting into the counterproductive realm. You can be as critical of China as you want, but you want to start putting the message out there that if you hold US Treasury bonds, you might not get your money back if the United States is not happy with you. That's a great way to have capital flee the United States and have higher interest rates and really punish yourself. We've seen other arguments, Senator Cotton and others pushing to deny Chinese studying in the United States.
Mhm.
This can get out of hand. So while I'm all for a very firm stand and being perfectly honest about what China is doing and what's wrong with it, we have to caution about doing things that aren't in our interest.
Thank you. And there's another question. I will read this question. It says, so far, there is basically zero visible transatlantic cooperation during this crisis. President Trump clearly prefers to talk to President Putin than to any EU allies. Why is that so? Do you at least see a space for some US-EU coordination of global economic recovery and probably handling of this crisis? Phil, let's start with you about that.
Yeah, I wish I did. And I think that point is well taken. And President Trump has often said, quote unquote, our allies are worse than our adversaries. And he says that about trade, and he says it in general, and he criticizes them all the time for not spending enough in NATO. And there's a very long list of ways in which I think he has undermined the transatlantic relationship. It's from the very beginning, pulling out of the Paris climate deal, which is of existential importance to the Europeans, questioning NATO's Article 5 defense guarantees, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, pulling troops out of Syria without telling our European allies who have troops there, just recently announcing a travel ban on Europe without telling the Europeans in advance, putting steel aluminum tariffs on Europeans under a shaky pretext of US national security. So I think already the relationship with Europe was deeply damaged. You see it in terms of public opinion polling of what Europeans think about the United States. And then in that context, to deal with this issue without close cooperation with our European partners, I just don't understand. So I'm afraid that it hasn't been the case. And I mentioned the case of the G7, which is mostly our European partners. There too, Secretary of State Pompeo turned it into a fight over whether to call it Wuhan, and missed the opportunity to coordinate, not just on handling the virus, but on the economic response to it. So I think, it's just a further reflection of the damage that the administration has caused to our partnerships, especially with the Europeans.
Shadi, how about you?
No, I agree with everything that Phil said. I mean, it's sort of, I think that sometimes it's hard to argue with common sense, and you'd think that certain things would be obvious, but we're at a point now where we have an administration where common sense things that reasonable folk and normal people pretty much all agree on, we have to go out of our way to make arguments that should be self-evident. So I think, just listen to Phil, and it should be very obvious, and it's not, and that's part of the reason we're in a sad situation.
And now, not directly related to Corona crisis, but there are questions about the Middle East, the sanctions on Iran, and today's news about Trump MBS, shall we say, disagreement, to be nice about that, about the oil prices. Would this coronavirus period, at least some kind of pause in, like foreign policy for the last 2 months, will bring any change to US policy in Middle East? Shadi, both about the Iran and MBS.
Yeah, well, first of all, while all this is happening, the world still goes on. And in the case of the Middle East conflicts still go on. And it happens to be the case that in two places where there are civil wars, at least, Libya and Yemen, you have militias and rebel groups that are trying to take advantage of coronavirus and the crisis and the lack of world attention to press their advantage and to intensify efforts. So you have some areas where violence is actually getting worse, where you might think, hey, there's a virus going on, or hey, it's Ramadan, can people like chill and take a nap in the afternoon? But that's not actually happening. So I think that at some point we're going to have to re-engage with very fundamental questions about the US role in the Middle East. And, sometimes people say, well, COVID is just going to reinforce the trend to disengagement with the Middle East. And, disengagement, the desire to disengage has been happening for many years now, not just with Trump. That was a trend that was starting under the Obama administration, where we kind of look at the Middle East and we say, hey, this is a mess. we don't want to get too involved, and the regional actors should take responsibility for their own region. But what we're going to find out after COVID, or for that matter, during COVID, as it's ongoing, is that the conflicts that are in some ways getting worse in the Middle East are going to come back to haunt us just like they always do. The Middle East has a way of drawing outside actors in. So this illusion that we can look inward and move in this more semi-isolationist direction, and a lot of people understandably are kind of sick of the Middle East and dealing with all those conflicts. But I think we're really going to be in for a rude awakening. You know, oil prices are going down, obviously going down significantly, and that's going to have an impact on oil-rich states. But COVID is going to hurt the economic situation of countries like Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon. We're already seeing greater instability. So we're going to have to be prepared a year from now, or whenever a new administration is say, hey, we can't turn our back from the Middle East because those conflicts are only getting worse. And we can't, what happens in the Middle East is going to have some effect, certainly on Europe, as we saw during the refugee crisis several years back, which is ongoing, but it has an impact on us as well as Americans. And that's why we keep on getting dragged back in.
Phil?
I mean, so first, that right there is an important point. I mean, the Middle East was already destabilized enough. Throw on top of that collapsing oil prices, so national budgets are strained. Even the countries that had money and oil money won't be able to use it to subsidize any others, and a potential health crisis that hasn't fully hit yet. It's hit very strongly in Iran, but it hasn't really spread as severely to other countries, but it well could. And as I mentioned earlier, they're hardly well placed to deal with that, which could exacerbate all of the other problems we've been dealing with, humanitarian, refugees, and so on. But on the two specific parts of the question that was asked, Iran, so COVID has displaced most other policies, but the administration has seemingly found time to pursue its Iran policies, and it's full steam ahead with this maximum pressure campaign, which I've been very clear all along. Have thought was just not succeeding. Trump came in and implied that if he tore up the nuclear deal that he didn't like and put pressure on Iran, that either it would come back to the table for a new and better deal, and it would refrain from meddling and interfering in neighboring countries, or it would become so impoverished that the people would rise up and sweep aside the regime. Well, we've been keeping that pressure on now for almost 2 years, and even tightening it, taking away the oil waivers, putting on new sanctions, and none of that has happened. On the contrary, its behavior in the Middle East in general, don't ask me, ask the Trump administration, is as problematic as ever. It's no longer cooperating with the nuclear deal, so it's expanding its nuclear activities in a way that at least that deal froze. And for all of the protests and disruption in Iran, the regime is still there and is repressive as ever. So I think the administration's Iran policy has been a complete failure up to now, but their response to that failure is always to just double down on the same policy. And we're seeing that now. It's even playing out this week with their calls to try to invoke snapback of Security Council sanctions on Iran to prevent the arms embargo from being lifted this coming October, as it's scheduled to do according to the deal. And without getting into all the details of that, this is going to further strain our relations with our allies and the other major powers like Russia and China, when we say 2 years after having formally withdrawn from the nuclear deal and said we weren't a participant, we're going to invoke the rights of a participant at the UN Security Council to snap back sanctions. So I think that is going to be just a further problem with our allied relationships, and I also don't think it's going to work. And then just briefly, I haven't seen the latest on Trump and MBS and oil, but I can imagine what it's about. And I would just say, Trump may have thought that he was in complete harmony with Riyadh over all of these issues. You'll recall his very first foreign trip anywhere was to Saudi Arabia, and he thought he sort of had a deal where the Saudis would buy US weapons and invest in the United States, or at least announce that they would, even if they didn't really do it. He was able to say they're creating jobs and we're going to together stand up to Iran, and we're going to be great partners. And in exchange for that, he sort of gave the Saudis a pass in Yemen, human rights, and he thought he had this great relationship. But it turns out that Saudi interests and American interests can diverge, and we're seeing that now with the crashing oil price. And I think, if Trump thought that somehow the Saudis would subordinate their own interests, because this is hurting them even more than it is us, and somehow find a way to cut production to the point where it saves U.S. oil companies, because Trump wants them to, I think, he will be disappointed, and that is no doubt. Again, I haven't seen the details, but if they have a difference, it's not particularly surprising.
Thank you. And there is one question. There are multiple questions about U.S. elections. So I will basically bring together in one question. It has 3 parts. First part, how do you think the COVID crisis will impact the election results? Number 2, how would a Biden presidency or Biden administration would handle this crisis? And the third one is, will Trump 2.0 be different in terms of international engagements, or would it be the same of, like the first period in his administration? Shadi, let's start with you. I know I interrupted you when you were talking about the potential Biden administration. So now it's time.
Yeah, well, so first of all, on election results, so I think in the lead up to the election, I think one thing we'll have to watch closely is whether there is a rally around the flag effect. I mean, earlier on in the crisis, it seemed like Trump was getting a bump in the opinion polls, and he reached actually some of his highest ever approval ratings. He's dipped down again now, so perhaps that effect isn't really lasting. But obviously, Trump is going to try to use the crisis and use his bully pulpit and the press briefings and all of that to really present himself in an appealing way. Clearly, that's not going to work for 50% of Americans or so. So, we'll see how he kind of, and a lot of it depends how bad the crisis is in September, October, or if we have a kind of second wave as we enter the fall and then winter and so on. So those are really open-ended questions. And then I don't like engaging too much in alarmism about Trump becoming an authoritarian and, postponing elections or canceling them or holding them in a way where the results aren't legitimate. But I think if it is very close, we may have some discussions, especially if the virus is still affecting people's ability to get to the polls. Then you could have a very, I think, worrying and problematic debate after the fact about legitimacy. So I do worry about that. At the same time, I don't want to engage in worst case scenarios, because usually the worst case scenarios don't actually come to pass, and hopefully they won't this time. And when it comes to Biden versus Biden or Trump being the president and all that, well, on Trump 2.0, well, first of all, I think we're all going to be in a situation of constant exhaustion if there's 4 more years of this performance and this crazy, this chaos. On a very basic level, I just think the chaos and uncertainty of 4 more years of Trump, we might actually see more of that, not less. I mean, Trump without having to worry about re-election, or Trump saying, well, hey, these are my last couple years, I'm going to go all out with my deepest desires. He clearly has already been doing that, but we could see an intensification of those deepest desires in ways that have, I think, very problematic impacts on the global scene. So that would be more of the same. I think what's interesting is that, a Biden administration, on the level of rhetoric, on the level of how we present ourselves to the world, will obviously be radically different. Now, we can have a debate about how different certain policies would actually be, but certainly rhetoric does matter. The perception of leadership does matter. And I think already, the rest of the world, I think more and more people abroad intuitively understand that we as Americans are not necessarily represented by our elected leadership. And I think there's been a shift in this. I remember back in the day when I was living abroad during George W. Bush, you know, a lot of us felt the need to apologize for the fact that we had elected George W. not just once, but twice. I think now when we go abroad, if we ever go abroad again, I think people understand that America is divided and that things can radically shift from one presidency to another. They saw how we elected Barack Obama, and then we went in a radically different direction and elected Donald Trump. And I think also if you look at other countries where they've elected unusual populist leaders like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Duterte in the Philippines, we don't meet a Brazilian abroad and think that they are somehow to blame for electing Bolsonaro, because we know that's kind of unusual. So I think that people are going to be ready to see us in a new light. And that could be I think, a very striking shift in just a kind of a new kind of goodwill. So I think there's going to be a period of 6 months to a year, if Biden wins, where there will be a sense of relief and a sense of openness to a new kind of rhetoric and a new American sensibility when it comes to how we present ourselves abroad.
Phil?
So I won't even attempt to, the election isn't for another 7 months, and it's unpredictable in the best of circumstances. So to really try to say how we don't know exactly what the situation will be then. And under normal circumstances, you would say that this obviously disadvantages President Trump. And I think you're saying that a little bit in the numbers. My take on the political situation used to be, as we've seen a lot of developments that you would have thought would undermine President Trump's support, but his supporters are just about as loyal as you could ever imagine. And that, his favorability number just barely changes over time because people are just decided. So it's hard to move that. And I used to say about that, we wouldn't really see it move unless there was something dramatic. A little bit like George W. Bush, when you had, the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans killed a lot of people and undermined the administration's reputation for competence. And then the Iraq War, where a lot of Americans were being killed, and that undermined President Bush's support. And, I would say that about President Trump too. You might not see the needle move really because people are so dug in unless something like that happened. Well, something like that is happening now. And there, so far 61,000 Americans who have died because of, obviously they all didn't die because of President Trump. But I think most people believe that the mishandling of this has made the situation worse, especially that period of 6 weeks when very little was done. So you would think that would undermine the president's election prospects. But we'll have to see where we are then. If expectations go way down, but then suddenly treatments go much more quickly than we would have thought, the economic recovery is better, then he'll be able to make the case. And he's obviously very good at the public relations part of this, and they're trying to spin it already. You couldn't exclude that he somehow recovers from this and turns it into a positive story. The thing I would say about Biden, and obviously I support the vice president to make a whole bunch of policy cases as to why we would be better off with him. The simple point I'd make about your question about how it would be different is just the sort of minimalist one. We would have, Shadi talked about this earlier when he made a comparison with Obama, who he has been otherwise critical of, but just the basic notion of having a president who is caring and competent and set to do what he can to deal with a situation like this. And I've noticed that looking at the leaderships abroad of Chancellor Merkel or President Macron. You can criticize them on all sorts of things, you can disagree with their approach, but you just get the sense that these are leaders whose overwhelming utter priority is doing their best to take care of their people. And here, we saw last night, starting at midnight, this president, instead of being focused like a laser on that, tweeting all sorts of crazy conspiracy things and not giving the impression, and he doesn't even talk about the people who have died, just not giving the impression that his overwhelming priority is that. So aside from every other reason we could give, I think on this point, the most critical difference would be just a president who would stock his cabinet full of competent people. I mentioned the Ebola precedent, and one close advisor of President Biden is Ron Klain, who handled that. And I think by all accounts handled it extremely well. I think that would serve the country well. And then lastly, and I know it's almost time to wrap up, but you asked about Trump 2.0. I think anyone who has watched the first 3.5 years of this presidency should keep their expectations in check about some pivot towards more internationalism. I would actually say that if Trump wins again, it's going to be more Trump 3.0. I would argue that actually the first year of his administration was somewhat constrained in this way. And he had more traditional foreign policy around advisors around him, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, and so on, who prevented him.
McMaster, yeah.
McMaster as well, Kelly. But then instead of changing the policies to match the advisors, he started to change the advisors to match the policies. And I think if reelected after that trend, Shadi said this as well, and I completely agree. I think he would feel just completely unconstrained, wouldn't have to worry about reelection, and would feel validated from the approach that he took. So, I mean, when you put all of those together, at least the second and third point, the stakes, I think, could not be higher in November.
Thank you very much. And this was last question, and our time is almost up right now, only 1 minute left. And there are a couple questions, so I have to ask you because there are insistent questions about what this crisis say about US. If you're gonna just say it in 30 seconds, both its handling in domestically and in foreign policy in the future, like now in Spanish flu and everything we are reading, like how US handled that and everything. After, let's say, 20, 30 years, when the historians are looking at this crisis, what will they say about the US? Phil, let's start with you.
So I already said, I think that the handling of this crisis has raised real questions, both at home and abroad, about US competence, global leadership, and excellence. I mean, exceptionalism. The United States has always seen itself, and many abroad also saw it, as exceptional in lots of ways, but including, I think people would have expected of all the countries who would be prepared and able to grapple with a crisis like this, that would have the resources, the transparent democratic system, the top scientists. I think we Americans always thought of our country as that one. Like no one would be better placed to handle something like this than us. There'd be a lot of other underdeveloped countries or autocracies who wouldn't be there, but we would have the resources and the abilities. And I think this has really questioned that in our minds and in foreign minds. What historians will say will partly depend on what comes next. So I do think the situation is salvageable, as I implied in my previous answer. And with a different administration, I think America still has a lot going for it and can recover. But I think if things go in the wrong direction, this could be seen as the turning point after many decades of the US being an exceptional country and a global leader. It would no longer be seen that way at home or abroad.
Shadi?
Yeah. So, obviously Trump has mishandled this and made it worse and all that. But I think at the same time, if you look at the numbers, deaths per million or per capita deaths, the US is somewhere in the middle of the pack. So I think we have to be careful.
Which is not particularly exceptional, right? I mean, that's part of the point, is middle of the pack is not great.
Yeah. But in terms of like comparing to Western European countries that we look at with, let's say, admiration, France has more deaths per million, Sweden has more, and Sweden is a very interesting case for its own reason. But this is just to say that, there are different ways of looking at this. And I'm actually glad and proud that we have a federalist system where when we have a central leader, someone as incompetent as Donald Trump, it's possible, and we have seen this in a number of states, where states and localities and municipalities actually step up and fill the gap of the federal government. And there is this sense of American resilience on the broader level because of the kind of system that we have. I mean, thank God we don't have a more intensely centralized system like France, which would be great if you have a competent leader who can manage that centralized response. But the danger of centralized approaches is that they're dependent on the person at the center. And we're in the unfortunate situation of having a not great person in that particular position. And last thing I'll just say is, I think that you can't have one leader who undoes America's exceptionalism. that our exceptionalism, if it exists, if you buy into that premise, transcends one leader or one election, and it's exceptionalism, if it's real, is something that is in the foundations of the state. And I'd say that I'm bullish on America in the sense that I think that those foundations aren't necessarily completely eroded, and that we can recover, and that we probably will.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Shadi, for your insights about this and your comments. And thanks for the participants, and thanks for the audience. And we will have another one next week on U.S. International security and in post-COVID world with Mary Beth Long and Luke Calfee. And hopefully we will have our audience there as well. Thanks again, and see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Kilic.
Thank you.
To be with you. Bye-bye.